Good afternoon. I augur that you're having a good conference and I regret not being present. Any feedback, written or otherwise, at a later stage would be much appreciated. In 2004, I completed a 4-year stint in London, where I was writing my doctoral thesis on Maltese media with particular focus on journalism. I had also spent an additional year lecturing and teaching there. The eclecticism of the city had grown on me. I had left a small island that was up till then rather homogeneous, with the exception of some tourists and some expats, and had quickly acclimatized to the multiculturalism of southeast London. I lived on New Cross Street, the street where the Brixton riots had started, and I studied at Goldsmiths College, in an institution where Stuart Hall, the great intellectual who explored the representation of otherness, was Professor Emeritus. Goldsmiths is also the alma mater of Linton Kwesi Johnson, the Jamaican-British dub poet, who became the only black poet to be published in the Penguin Modern Classics and who was a regular visitor there. Up till then, in my research on Maltese journalism, I was mainly interested in political polarization that had haunted Maltese media for many, many decades. And it had even overwhelmed then the debate on membership within the European Union. By the time I returned to Malta in 2005, I quickly observed a new form of polarization that went beyond the old party lines. This new polarism in journalism revolved around divergent narratives on migration. It was then that I started interviewing journalists to look at the views on migration vis-à-vis new realities that were facing Malta, that included European membership, but also the new challenges that included migration and multiculturalism. My research looks at Maltese journalists' perceptions on immigration since the arrival of the first boat people. My empirical research is based on in-depth interviews with journalists that were conducted over a span of around 12 years, where some journalists performed the role of public intellectuals, having an important interpretative role in spite of ample popular resentment. The role of public intellectuals cannot be underestimated. Earlier this year, a survey that was conducted by Malta Today confirmed that the Maltese respondents became more open and supportive of integration policies when they were given sufficient information. Hence, ignorance is indeed extremely dangerous and leads many individuals to become susceptible to anti-immigrant narratives. During these years, it transpired that some journalists and even columnists, namely those writing for English language media, formed a common front that championed the rights of immigrants and pressed the Maltese authorities to honour international obligations. These journalists advocate humanitarianism and a notion of security that emphasises justice and the protection of immigrants' rights. While these journalists have ample opportunity to set the agenda, they are aware of the textual polysemy that permits readers to interpret and reject their text. And I'm here citing one of the journalists that I recently interviewed. He said, "The divide fosters tricky situations that almost encourage self-censorship because I know that what I write will somehow be manipulated." Interactive media permit readers to actively oppose the message to an extent that some journalists expressed anxiety about audience responses that include online comments, the social media, and also letters to the editor, which are prone to be extremely xenophobic. On comment boards, journalists are often subject to vicious attacks by irritated readers when they are seen as being sympathetic with the plight of others. As most media organizations are now reluctant to serve as a platform to racists and Islamophobes, it was observed that these migrated to the social media, where there is a virtual echo chamber that has not yet turned into a significant voting constituency. This presents an interesting scenario which reveals that the three main commercial newspapers that are struggling to retain their market share in view of bigger competition are not yet completely audience-driven. In this context, journalists are still clearly treating their readers as citizens rather than consumers. While human interest stories are vital, they are employed to represent the migrant experience of poor individuals, and journalists are aware that such stories tend to foster reductionist perspectives unless they are embedded within a discussion of wider social and political processes. Since the days of my first interviews, my early interviews, it transpired that Maltese journalists often face dilemmas in their treatment of migration vis-à-vis national interest. Some journalists were in fact prone to accept orthodox perspectives similar to those often employed by the state and political parties, that is, that we should be securing our borders and keeping the wrong people out. Most of these journalists worked for Maltese language political media, and they appeared overly sympathetic to the challenges faced by the armed forces to control immigration, their challenges in their daily running of detention centres, and the problems that are faced in deporting some of the detainees. And this is what one of these journalists had to say. He said, "I support Maltese soldiers and I write about their conditions. I feel that some other journalists, especially those working with the independent press, scorn the role of the armed forces and they make derogatory remarks." And somehow he was quite sympathetic with the armed forces and with the police. So there is a group of journalists, and I have to say that there were more of them in the early days, that brush aside political correctness, and they were more concerned with the negative impact of those who were deemed to be trespassing into our national territory, creating what was deemed to be a burden on national resources. And there were few occasions when these journalists look at the great contribution which immigrants can make to economic growth and cultural enrichment. In the Maltese context, media ownership matters. Irrespective of personal views, journalists put first the editorial line of their organization, and they only employ an advocacy role because they enjoy the freedom to take this path. In the case of the non-party media, their choice of experts and sources tend to frame migration from humanitarian perspectives, even in those instances when journalists cited professional ideology, such as news value criteria or the axiom of objectivity, to justify their reportage of issues related to migration. In partisan media organizations, the individual journalist's opinion on immigration has to fit the broader political interests of the parent organization, that is, the political party. Throughout the past 15 years, these positions were not always consistent. The two mainstream political parties walk a tightrope between what their constituents think and their moral obligations. Both feared that by ignoring public sentiment or resentment, they risked losing the support of some of their grassroots to the far right. The General Workers' Union and its newspapers have a rather volatile relationship with immigrants that ranged from viewing immigrants suspiciously as threats to hard-earned work conditions of Maltese workers, to supporting the plight of migrants as symbols of the contemporary precariat. The media outlets that stood squarely behind the immigrants from the very first arrivals were those belonging to the Catholic Church, where religious sub-organizations became key sources of news as they immediately embraced immigrants, first from a charity perspective and later as promoters of their rights. From the very beginning, church-owned media paid attention to the choice of words in news texts. They did not label immigrants as illegali or clandestini, even when other media organizations unwittingly or sometimes intentionally employed a language that criminalized all immigrants that arrived without official papers. To conclude, I have to say that journalists are currently grappling with matters that are related to integration processes and minority rights. In the past years, Maltese journalism developed a critical mass so that more individuals see themselves as public intellectuals with a significant interpretative role. Advocacy journalism is frequently employed, and non-state actors like NGOs, both national and international, have become important sources of news in this area. There is a degree of reflexivity among media professionals as they face ample popular resentment, especially in view of integration processes and the rights of ethnic minorities. In spite of this, the migration debate remains polarized, and as a result, other journalists chose a cautious position, and they cite professional ideology, including the notion of objectivity and news value criteria, to legitimate their editorial decisions. They tend to rely more on formal state sources, including enforcement agencies, but it is increasingly difficult for them to ignore the humanitarian plight and the struggles for minority rights. In my view, Malta has a pluralistic media system that must become less polarized and more inclusive. And here are some proposals. While there is a healthy ongoing debate and there is a broad consensus on the social responsibility of the legacy media, there should be more initiatives that encourage media workers at all levels to become culturally sensitized. Training programs aimed at professionals need to be complemented by initiatives aimed at the producers of user-generated material, the so-called citizen journalist. The University of Malta and the Journalist Institute and other organizations can play a significant role in this. The legacy media need to do more. One interesting initiative was the publication of the newspaper Side by Side by SOS Malta that was distributed as a supplement with one of the main papers and focused on third country nationals. Unfortunately, this soon folded as soon as European funding ended. The migrants' voice needs to be heard. PBS has public service obligations, and the migrant voices need to be heard not merely in the content, but even to be involved in decision-making processes too. The social media are a good venue for immigrants to put their message across, but I believe that some training is also necessary so that immigrants and ethnic minorities learn how to step out of their own echo chambers to reach out to the rest of society. And media ethics should be updated to ensure that racial and ethnic minorities are not subjected to mockery and animosity coming from extreme and sensationalist voices.